I knew that the hours could be long. I knew the hours could be tough on family life, but I really couldn't get past the fact that I love people. I love being around people. I love making people happy. And in the restaurant, I was able to do all those things.
I think I met the most interesting man alive, and his name is Narsai David. Hi friends, welcome to the Assyrian podcast for episode 142. My name is Odessa, and I had the absolute pleasure of chatting with Mr. Narsai David. Born in South Bend, Indiana in the U.S.A. in 1936, he lived in the Midwest before he and his family made their way to California in the Central Valley. Having grown up helping his mother with cooking and later through different jobs, one thing was always at the center of what he did and did well, and that was food. He has had a long and successful career in the food and wine industry, working in and managing other restaurants before starting his own business. Thanks to the famous rock impresario Bill Graham, Narsai catered for some of the most famous rock and roll bands and later opened up the renowned Narsai's restaurant. The wine list at Narsai's was described as one of the 10 finest in the world by the New York Times. In our conversation, Narsai talks about his journey through food and wine, which has taken on many exciting turns. He has had a long stint as a radio personality and continues to make regular appearances on radio as food and wine editor of KCBS Radio in San Francisco. He is also a published author and has frequently made TV guest appearances. What I find most impressive about Narsai, though, is despite his personal success, he has always made time to be involved and give back to the community. Having served in multiple organizations throughout his life, including Assyrian Aid Society, his many contributions include the prestigious Narsai's Taste of the Mediterranean event, which has raised millions for Assyrian humanitarian aid. To me, it's a reminder that no matter how successful we become in our lives, it is important to remain connected and give back to your community. I thoroughly enjoy learning more about him, and I know you will too. Listen in as we discuss his upbringing, his career in food and wine, and his love and connection to his Assyrian heritage. But first, support for this week's episode of the Assyrian podcast is brought to you by Tony Kalogerakis and the injury lawyers of Illinois and New York. If you know anyone that has been in a serious accident, please reach out to Tony Kalogerakis. Tony has been recognized as a top 40 lawyer and a rising star by Super Lawyers publication and has obtained multiple multi-million-dollar awards. Tony can be reached at injuryrights.com or 847-982-9516. This episode is also sponsored by the U.S.A. Partners, a husband and wife real estate team. Are you considering purchasing or selling a home in Arizona or California? John and Rita are available to help make your next real estate decision into a seamless transaction. Contact the Oshanas at 209-968-9519. Get to know them a little bit more by checking out their website, the Oshana, that is OUSHANA, partners.com. Now, without further ado, here is Narsai David. Thank you so much, Narsai, for being a guest on the Assyrian podcast. We are very, very lucky to have you on. Your Wikipedia page says that you are 84 years old. Is that true?
It sure is. And in a couple of months, I'll be 85.
All right. So you're born in 1936?
Right.
Something that I had noticed when I was reading about you was that there aren't many elderly people I know who have Assyrian names. Interestingly enough, why did your parents decide to name you Narsai?
Oh boy, that's a good question. My father is from Marbishu in southeast Turkey, up in the hills, and my mother was born in Ada in Urmi. So we used to call my father's people Shopidnai and my mother's people Urmishnai. And as you know, it was kind of unusual for having a marriage that brought the two of those together. But that's the way their marriage did come together in Chicago. And my father was quite dedicated to the church. As I was a young kid, we grew up in Chicago until I was 10 years old. And when I was like 7 or 8, he would take me to church with him every Sunday, even though we would normally go to a local church on Sundays that had a Sunday school. But on any of the holy days or special days, feast days and such, he would always take me with him. I was the oldest, and he insisted we speak Assyrian at home. He said, there's no way he could teach us English as well as we're going to learn it on the outside, but we need to speak Assyrian at home to preserve that. And there was this real commitment to maintaining the history. And I'll tell you in a minute about his history. But so I was given the name Narsai Michael David. My father's name was Michael, so I was Narsai Michael David. And my
And when you said
middle
church,
brother
is it the Church of the East?
Yes, Church of the East. Thank you. And my next brother is Chenu Michael David. We all have Michael for our middle name. That was our father's name. And my youngest brother is James Michael David. In fact, his name was supposed to be Ogyar. And somewhere along the way, I'm frankly a little confused. I think it was the baptismal record called him Ogyar. And then by the time they filed the birth certificate, it became James Michael David. And Chinu is my father's name. So he's known as Ken. And the kids used to jokingly call him Kano when they saw his whole name spelled out. But he's a tough guy, and he made it clear that his name was Ken. And I'm Jim, but I've always been Narsai. Friends call me Nars.
And you mentioned that your parents were born in Southeast Turkey and Iran, and then they eventually made their way to the United States. What brought them to the U.S.?
Well, when the fighting got really crazy, my mother's village had to leave. My father had already come earlier.
Do you remember what year?
Yeah, my dad came in 1912.
Wow.
In fact, let me tell you a little bit about his history. His uncle, his Mamuna, his father's brother, Rahana was actually dedicated to the church in Zira. You know the word in Zira? It's an Assyrian word for somebody that's dedicated to the church. From the time of his conception, his mother stopped eating meat, and he never tasted meat in his entire life. He had seafood, and technically that's limited to flesh fish and no shellfish. And one day he sort of quietly, get this, admitted to me that he had had shrimp once, which was kind of cute. But there was always this close religiosity, and he never went beyond the position of deacon, shamasha. He was known throughout the country of Assyrians as Shamasharahana. And in Chicago, he built the first Church of the East. He had come early and started a Persian rug business and did very, very well, made good money, and decided that it would serve his people the best and his family the best if he did not elevate him in the church, but rather stay with the business because it was making good money. I'll never forget reading a letter that he showed me once where he could save Assyrian lives for $1 a piece in cash. And there were just horrible things that were still going on in the Middle East. And he was sending money back. He built the first Assyrian church of the East in Chicago. He built the first Assyrian Church of the East in Gary, Indiana. Wow. So we were very much endowed with wanting to be Assyrians.
That's quite impressive. And so your dad came in 1912. When did your mother come?
Then she was in Urmi, and when the craziness started at the beginning of the war, suddenly the Kurds and the Turks together got rid of the Assyrian problem and drove the Assyrians out of the villages. Her husband,
as in your mother's father,
had already come to the United States and was working as a janitor to raise enough money to bring the rest of the family. But when the fighting started, she loaded an ox-drawn cart, and her 6 children, one of them, she had 7 children, one had been lost at sea on the Sea of Urmi with the fighting. And she took the remaining 6 kids, loaded them on the cart, and they were able to draw milk from the ox, and en route to North Iraq, where civil encampments were set up for the Assyrians, she would trade that milk for other food and medical supplies with the British army that she met along the way. And she was a real trooper, that woman, and got the family into Iraq and got them settled in. And as soon as my grandfather had raised enough money for their passage, which it was like 2 or 3 years later. So she didn't get to the United States until 1918. And yeah, that's right, because she was born in 05. So she was 13 when she arrived, and she was the youngest of the 7 children. So that gets us to Chicago.
And according to your Wikipedia, you were born in Indiana. Is that true?
South Bend, Indiana. Yeah. For the first 2 years, we lived in South Bend. And my father had a cousin, Berat Mamunu, named Esyet David, married to a man named Enter. And my dad was a little bit taller and a lighter complexion than many of the Assyrians. And he spoke English very well, had a very handsome presentation, personality. And he would go around to, let's say, roughly a 100-mile radius of Chicago. The rug store was in Chicago. And they would announce at these fancy furniture stores that the Middle East rug expert, Mike David, is coming to visit and to answer all your questions. And we have a sale on these rugs, et cetera, et cetera. And he would make the rounds. And we always joked about the fact that NTS yet had given him a key to the house, because sometimes he'd get there late at night on a train and sleep in the guest bedroom, and he would always leave a penny on the pillow to show that he'd been there, because he was off so quick the next morning to go off to the next town. And so we had a close relationship with that family as well. Occasionally we would spend summer vacations in South Bend visiting her, or in Flint, Michigan, visiting my mother's sister who lived there. But
were there other Assyrians in Indiana?
Yeah, there was a small settlement in and around South Bend, a somewhat larger settlement in Gary. In fact, my father's best man at his wedding was named Benjamin, and he had a son, Adam Benjamin, who was the first Assyrian to ever been elected to Congress of the United States. So that goes back long before Anna Ishu, who was the second member of Congress to be an Assyrian.
Wow. So Benjamin, what was the last name?
Adam Benjamin. Benjamin was the last name. Adam Benjamin.
Wow. What brought Assyrians to Indiana?
Well, it was where they came. They went to where the jobs were. They all landed in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you've ever seen an old railroad map of America, Chicago is like the hub, and these spokes go off in every direction.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that hub is where manufacturing was. The stockyards were there. Within 100-mile radius, you had all of the factories in Flint, Michigan, and Detroit. You know, there's a huge Chaldean Assyrian community in Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
But it all started back in those days where people went for the jobs. In South Bend, there were automobile manufacturing. I mentioned the stockyards in Chicago. It was just the center of so much activity. And it's clear that as soon as they had found enough money to buy a piece of dirt, the Assyrians, coming from an area where it was warm practically year round, they wanted to get into a climate that was comfortable for them. And Turlock happened to be the perfect target. And now when people ask me, well, how did they settle on Turlock? Let me give you my version of why they settled in Turlock. And I was in Iran in 1974. I went to find my mother's birthplace. I went to Ada and actually met a family who remembered my mother's family. It was a little bit remote, but at least there was a bit of a connection. 2 years later, I was in the south of Spain, in Granada. And there was this strange thing, because all the time I was in Granada, I kept thinking of Turlock and Ada, Turlock and Ada. My wife could tell you that, you know, those were the days before we had a computer in our hip pocket in the form of a phone. I got home from that trip and I wanted to see an atlas before I did anything else. And I looked up Turlock, Granada, and Auda and found that they were within 17 miles of the same line of latitude.
Mm.
So now when people ask me, how did the Assyrians get in Turlock? I know that they all headed for California because that was obviously going to be the most likely place. And in Turlock, some guy got off the train and said, gee, this feels kind of good. Let's have a cup of coffee and check it out. And in a couple of days, he had found a piece of land and bought it. And he sent a telegram to his brother in Detroit and his cousin in Flint and his uncle in Chicago. And the migration started. It was in the late 20s. I think 29, as I recall, is about the earliest the Assyrians got to Turlock.
Yeah, Dr. Ariane Shaya has a book about the Assyrians of California, and it's more or less that story.
It's
And
so clear.
we were an agricultural people, and so that
Right.
soil was just as comparable to that of where they were in Iran, and so they planted their roots there. But interestingly enough, before they settled in California, a lot of those people, some of the first ones who are descendants of the Adams family, were actually in Canada. They had come to Canada originally. I believe it's Saskatchewan, which is just, it's a very cold place. Nothing like nothing like the temperature or soil like in Iran. And so they continued to make their way down to California, and that ended up proving to be something that was comparable. Now, your family, and you eventually ended up moving to California. What brought the move?
Well, in 1946, we came to California. My father had been diagnosed with leukemia, which is a cancer of the blood. And to this day, I don't know if the doctors were naive enough to think warm weather would help him in his life, or whether they were such good psychologists that they said, let this man go to where he would really like to be with his people. And he, in fact, died in 1951. So he lived 5 years in Turlock. I'm the oldest of three, and by that point, I was 15 years old. And we had moved to a little spot just outside the city limits of Turlock. It was almost an acre of land. We had chickens and rabbits. We had an enormous vegetable garden. There were 7 walnut trees, an olive tree. My dad planted a row of grapevines. I think there were more for the grape leaves for Dolma than there were for the grapes themselves. And there were no daughters in the family, so the boys had to chip in with the work in the kitchen. She would can 100 quarts of tomatoes every year. Tomatoes, I've often said that the square root of my mother's cooking is tomatoes, onions, and basil. And all of those came out of the garden. And we would sit around the table, my 2 brothers and myself, in the kitchen, and race to see who could pit the peaches the fastest or who could peel the tomatoes the fastest. It became a fun thing for the family. So all 3 of us grew up not only knowing how to cook, but enjoying cooking. It was part of what it was all about. And life in Turlock was quite comfortable. Once my dad died, things changed pretty substantially.
I was going to ask, he was there for 5 years, and then here you are, the eldest son. I'm assuming, did
Right.
you take on a lot of the responsibility?
Right. I became the one that butchered the chickens and the rabbits. My mother made cheese. When you talk about gypta tu morta,
Mhm.
this was really gypta tu morta. What the cheese she made was a fairly simple, plain white cheese, but she would then grind it through a little meat grinder, add salt and some fennel seed, mayana seed, and pack it into quart jars and bury it in the ground. And in Turlock, you could get away with this. Anywhere else, you'd probably get poisoned by chemicals or something. But the soil is so soft and friable that the jar had just a piece of cotton fabric over the top that was tied on with a string. And then it's buried upside down, because if there were a heavy rainstorm or you irrigated, if it were right side up, obviously it could be contaminated. But when it's upside down and the soil is so friable that it never backs up, moisture drains out. And after a year, you dig it up and it's dry and crumbly and has that wonderful smell of aged cheese. I mean, they were accomplishing what's done in caves, but there were no caves around. So they created their own version of that.
Incredible. And at that time, what did the responsibilities look like within the household? Did your mom, as a result, have to go out and work? Were you, as the sons, going out working?
All of the above. In Turlock, about the only job she could get was working in a cannery during the summer, and that was like 26 weeks. And then 26 weeks, she drew unemployment compensation, which was something like $22 a week or something like that. So I took a job working after school at the Purity Market in downtown Turlock in the butcher shop. I would clean the meat slicer. Well, first I would slice luncheon meats and cheeses to fill the case for the next day. And then I would break down and wash the bandsaw and the meat slicer and the grinder and all of that stuff. And in my last year, my last year of high school, I managed to get 2 scholarships to the University of California, to Berkeley. And when I got to, then this summer that I graduated, I went to the vice principal at the high school because I was really tired of doing field work. We harvested more melons and there was this wonderful deacon, Shamasha, in the church, U.S.A, that had a sizable ranch. He grew watermelons mainly in the summertime. He raised chickens. In fact, I spent a few weeks one summer vaccinating baby chicks, which was a crazy deal.
What is the process to vaccinate baby?
Well, you pick up this tiny thing that's no bigger than a couple of eggs, and you poke the needle in it.
Right.
And his wife was a great cook, but you can bet we ate chicken every day for lunch, one form or another. And he taught me how to drive that tractor. So I couldn't turn it at the ends. He had the trailer behind it, and we would windrow the melons, a team of 3 or 4 or 5, depending on the width of the lane, would march across the field in unison, and we'd toss the melons from one to the other to get them to the row where the tractor could come through. And then I would drive the tractor from one end to the other while he was off doing something else, and he would come and turn it around and into the next lane, and I'd drive it back the other way. So that summer, when I graduated, I went to the high school vice principal and said, there's surely got to be something else that I could do. I had spent one summer working in a cannery, which was really the grungiest job I've ever had in my life. But he said, do you like to cook? And I said, yeah, actually I do. He said, well, this drive-in restaurant called Hendy's Drive-In is looking for a cook's helper. So I went and got a job as a cook's helper. So in September, I came to Berkeley to go to Cal. I signed up to live in a student co-op. And I went to this huge drive-in at the corner of Telegraph and MacArthur. It was a round drive-in like they have in that movie American Graffiti, where the car hops are on skates rolling around. And I walked into the kitchen and told the chef I was looking for a job as a fry cook. And he looked at me. I had just turned 17 that summer, and he was trying to make up his mind whether to kick me out or laugh at me. But I guess he figured if I was serious enough to stand there and look him in the eye and tell him I wanted a job. And I'm looking in the kitchen, and the cooks are all these war veterans that have a package of Lucky Strikes rolled up in their T-shirt sleeve, And I guess he figured if this kid is bold enough to ask for a job, maybe he'll work in the fountain. So he said, listen, Sonny, you ever pop sodas down there in Turlock? And I said, oh, yeah, I used to come in on my days off. Well, that was a bit of an exaggeration. But long story to make it short, I got a job as a soda jerk that summer. So now I've had some experience in a restaurant, and I quickly became the kitchen manager at the co-op house. And the next year I became the head of the nutrition food committee for all 7 of the co-op houses.
And is Hendy's Drive-In still open?
Hendy's in Turlock, no, he had two of them. He had one in Turlock and one in Ceres. Yeah, they disappeared many years ago. The one in Oakland, High's Drive-In, has disappeared as well. But it was interesting because it was a place that was determined to be the single busiest traffic intersection in America.
Wow.
First of all, California had more cars than anybody else to begin with because it's so spread out. But MacArthur Boulevard was the only way to get onto the Bay Bridge from the East Bay. And Telegraph Avenue was one of the main north-south arterials. And so right at that corner is where they put High's Drive-In to get that amount of traffic. And I met some interesting people working there as a soda jerk. One guy operated this plant in the little town of Emeryville, which is wedged in between Berkeley and Oakland. There was a large mill that melted down car bodies and made reinforcing rod. Well, when this group got together to build a Church of the East in San Francisco, they needed some rebar to build a concrete. We actually bought a home out in the Sunset District and converted the downstairs into a meeting center, and it required putting in a concrete slab. Well, this guy immediately volunteered to donate all the rebar we needed, and then he lined up a concrete contractor that bought steel from him and got him to donate the concrete as well for the church. And maybe I should sidetrack a little bit to keep my involvement in the church and the Assyrians going. Early on in Turlock, I had been an altar boy, Garuya, in the Church of the East. And I used to actually read the segment from the Bible that was on assignment that Sunday in Assyrian. And then I became a hupadiakna, a subdeacon. And both of those ordinations were by Marshuman. Then Marshuman consecrated a man who took the name Martuma to be the designate for Malabar and India. And at that same consecration, when he consecrated Martuma, then Martuma turned around and ordained 3 deacons, Shamasha, and I was one of those.
So you're a Shamasha of the Church of the East.
I'm a Shamasha of the Church of the
Oh my
East.
goodness.
So I helped in getting the church built, and I was involved with the church.
And this was the Narsai Church in San Francisco.
Right. It wasn't called Narsai at that time, but that's what it is now. And the patriarch gave a dispensation to one of the older Assyrian men, one who was from the old country, to read the New Testament evangels. He did the entire sermon in Assyrian one week, and I would do the sermon in English the next week. And I got some help at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. They let me use their library so I could get material and write my talks.
Could you paint a picture, or can you describe for listeners who haven't attended that church what that church looks like? Because it's a relatively small church.
It's a relatively small church. The most memorable thing to me was when the second floor, which had been the bedrooms, all the walls were knocked down to create a large enough surface. And my mother's first cousin, a man named Luther Warda, was a plaster contractor. And he built this beautiful curved arch that was in the front out of plaster. And I can't tell you what a thrill it was as a kid watching them do this thing, because they nailed up a screening of some kind of, it wasn't chicken wire, it was a finer texture than chicken wire, but some kind of a coarse mesh wire. And he troweled on a layer of mud, as he called it. And it just sort of gave you a funny little outline that maybe that was going to be a curved thing. And then once that's set up, he came back and a more refined trowel that had deeper grooves cut into it. And about the 3rd or 4th layer of plaster that was put on, suddenly there was this beautiful, perfect arch. And by the time it was painted out, it was just like it was a piece of stone. You would never know. So yeah, I watched that go up sort of from the scratch.
Do you remember what year the church was built?
Oh my goodness. I would have been, well, the church would have been built in the 1950s. I would guess it was 51, 2, 3, somewhere in there.
Somewhere in the 50s. Now, when you went to UC Berkeley, I mean, UC Berkeley is a very reputable university.
Yeah, that's an
And
understatement.
yeah, and so, you being the first in your family to be going to college and at that a university like UC Berkeley, what was that like for your family? What did that mean for your family?
Unfortunately, since my dad had died and I had two younger brothers still in Turlock, living with my mother on a very, very limited income, I used to send her my check more often than not, my paycheck. And 2 years after I got to Berkeley, my brother Ken moved up to Berkeley to be with me, and I couldn't live in the student co-op anymore because that was limited to people who were active students, and he didn't qualify. So we rented a little apartment together, and about the time he got settled into a job and things were straightening out a little bit for him, the youngest brother came up to join us. So we moved into a house where all three of us could live. And as you've probably picked up the drift here, I was drifting further and further away from college. I would have originally graduated in 1957, but I took my last class in 1958 and I still didn't graduate. It just didn't happen. My mother, by the way, some 7 years after my dad died, did remarry, and I'm grateful for her that she was able to live a more comfortable life. The man had been successful, having been in the trucking business with his brother. They hauled produce and various things, and then son had started a similar thing. So he was very comfortable. He had some daughters living in San Jose. They would frequently go to San Jose to visit them or come up to Berkeley to visit the girls in San Jose or the boys in Berkeley.
Wonderful.
So
Was he Assyrian by chance?
oh yeah, sure, definitely.
Oh, okay. And so
William Chennu was his name.
okay. So when your brothers came and joined you in Berkeley, it wasn't necessarily that your mother was to be left alone in Turlock. She had company of her own.
That fits in very smoothly there.
What are your earliest memories of food?
Of food?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Let's go back to Chicago when I would go with my mother and my grandmother to the end of the streetcar line to the Forest Preserve. And we would go out into the forest and harvest yerka. I mean, this was to make yerka, this wonderful Lenten dish that happens to be one of my favorite memories of food. And we would pick wild leeks and wild garlic and the tendrils off of grapevines. There was one other vegetable, I can't remember what it's called in Assyrian or in English. And then my mother always bought leeks and onions from the store to add to that. And then it was cooked with rice. There was no animal product in it at all because it was a Lenten dish. That just instantly flashes. Then the harissa that we always had at Christmas time. And the craziest of all would have to be the rishakli that we had for New Year's Day. And some people still have a hard time dealing with rishakli. And, if you think about it, rishakli, that means head and feet, risha and ekli, rishakli. So it's poor people's food. It's the innards food. It's the stuff that the people in the back of the house get. And by golly, it was fascinating to me that it's funny, there was no prohibition against alcohol in our home, but we rarely used any. Living in Turlock, one of my mother's brothers lived in San Francisco, and he would come down to visit occasionally and bring a bottle of brandy or a bottle of some beer or wine. And what they didn't drink together at dinners would be sitting on the shelf the next time he came back. But by golly, when we had the rishakli, my mother would suddenly show up with a bottle of brandy and go around the table and offer a glass to each of the men. Shtile aha, bit pashire It's going to melt the fat,
Yeah.
is what she was saying. And it's probably true that in the presence of alcohol, you metabolize fat a little more quickly. So that's those are the quickest memories. Of course, her dolma is beyond approach, I should say. Everybody has a familiar story with dolma. Well, my mother made it the way she made it, and the grape leaf dolma. She used to say that as kids in Ada, they were proud of helping make the dolmas, so that the dolmas were the smallest of anybody's, and they always had at least one piece of meat in each one.
Mm.
So being small means you pick the really tender grape leaves, not these tough things that you buy in a jar these days. And then when she made dolma kalama, the cabbage dolma, it was sweetened with a little bit of brown sugar and always with tomatoes. And she unabashedly used pork when
Mm.
she made the cabbage dolma. I don't know where that tradition got started, but it sure works well with that sweet and sour flavor of the dolma. And then everybody's all-time favorite was the dolma chutta. And for the dolma chutta, she would scoop out zucchini, squash, and Japanese eggplant, and there would be stuffed tomatoes and stuffed peppers. Not these big bell peppers, but the kind of peppers we grew in the garden. They were sort of visualize a large size jalapeno, but not the hot peppery one. I mean, these were in the shape of that, but they were more like a bell pepper in terms of flavor. But you had all these different vegetables stuffed and baked together. Her rice, they used to joke about how you could never find two grains of rice stuck together. Well, believe me, with the amount of butter she put in that rice, there was no way they were going to be stuck together.
That's wonderful, and so many great memories of Assyrian dishes. Hadisa being my favorite, of course. Yeah, hadisa
Yeah.
is like comfort food, soul food for
Oh,
me.
yeah.
Narcy, what would you say was your first real experience in the food industry?
Well, the first real experience was that
As a cook
working
in the
at that
drive-in?
High's Drive-In,
Mhm.
well, the Hendy's Drive-In, flipping hamburgers. But then I became head of food services during the time that I was at the student co-op, and then I had worked in a couple of other restaurants as a student right near campus, and a job opened up in Berkeley. There was a little restaurant called the Potluck, and it had started down at the foot of University Avenue, and was producing sort of bistro style food. They brought a large tureen of soup to the table, and then a large bowl of salad with three different dressings. You could help yourself. The meal itself was a piece of meat, some rice pilaf, and a vegetable. In those days, the vegetables were frozen, usually peas or string beans, and they had beer. And it was called a potluck because each day you literally took potluck. It was like a little tiny French bistro. And they moved to a new location, expanded, put in a full liquor license, built a complete kitchen. We got a partner that put some money in. And I hit it off really well with him, working as a relief bartender once or twice a week. And in 1959, he offered me a job as manager. And, I love people, I love food, I love wine, I really like making people happy. And I was able to do all that while being in the restaurant business.
Mm.
So it was a tough period, and I had signed up for the Army Reserve, which meant I would have to serve 6 months of active duty and 5.5 years in the reserve. And my call up came at about the same time he offered me the job to manage the potluck. And I had to leave for 6 months for active duty. When I came back from the active duty, it turned out that the guy he had hired had not worked out very well, and the job was still open.
Oh, wow.
Well,
That was
by
in your
that
favor.
time, I knew I knew that the hours could be long. I knew the hours could be tough on family life, but I I really couldn't couldn't get past the fact that I enjoy, I love people. I love being around people. I love making people happy. And in the restaurant, I was able to do all those things.
Hmm.
So I accepted the job, and I was manager for 11 years until 1970 when I left to start my own catering business. And gosh, we did some crazy catering jobs. I met Bill Graham, the rock and roll promoter in San Francisco, and I did all these massive shows that he did at the Oakland Coliseum. They're called A Day on the Green. And I provided all the food backstage for the entertainers. I had young kids that would come to me begging to let them work. They would work for no money just to be around the people backstage. Well, I wasn't going to have anybody working for no money, but it was funny because by the time the music started to play, I jumped in my car and drove off. It wasn't my kind of music. And gee, I went to Ontario, Southern California. We did some shows for him down there at the Ontario Speedway.
I once came across one of your interviews from
Was that?
the California Jam concert back in
Oh
1974,
my!
where you catered. And I guess for listeners, I mean, the context of how many people were there was what, about 400,000? Headlines like Black Sabbath, Eagles, Earth, Wind, and Fire. And I remember you were saying you didn't just feed regular festival food.
Well, we had the backstage food, and first of all, each entertainer had a clause in the contract that enabled them to require certain foods and beverages to be there.
Mhm.
And we had a checklist for each one of the trailers that the entertainers had. And this guy wanted 2/5 of Jack Daniel's Black Label, and this guy wanted a fifth of Dom Perignon champagne, and the other guy wanted a bottle of Skippy peanut butter. I mean, it was whatever they felt like had to be in their trailer when they came back there. And then for a while, Bill had this assistant who considered himself a serious restaurateur, and he would have me bring whole New York strips that we would roast on an outdoor grill. And when the favored people came through, he would order a slice to be cut off, and a thick slice or a thin slice or whatever, and did more exotic and more special stuff. Then one summer, for it was the last performance of the band. It was called The Last Waltz, and we did a Thanksgiving dinner for 3,000 people. And Bill Graham would not allow me to buy whole boneless turkey. He wanted the turkeys to be roasted on the bone. And by golly, we went into the basement of Winterland and knocked out a row of windows and put in some big fans to act as exhaust blowers. I rented a large truck and we went down Mission Street in San Francisco, which used to have a lot of restaurant equipment stores, used equipment stores. And I bought all these ranges that we hooked up down there. A plumber came in and hooked it all up. And after the show, by the way, we put those stoves on the same truck, went back down the same street, and in one instance, we actually sold it back to the guy we had bought it from at a lower price than we paid for it, obviously. But by golly, we prepared the entire meal fresh on whole turkeys. And it's just about time for a break when they're going to come out into the entrance areas where we had set up the buffet tables. And I turned to Bill and said, it's just this funny feeling in your gut. What if somebody screwed up or did something wrong with the dressing and some people get sick? And he turned around and said, Narsai, remember, you're only as good as your last show. Thankfully, nobody got sick. And then a year or two later, he wanted he would do an all night concert on New Year's Eve, and he wanted to serve breakfast at 6 a.m. on New Year's Day to 6,000 people. This was divided into two venues: the Carousel Ballroom and the auditorium simultaneously. And he would not let me use pre-cracked eggs. Like they use in bakeries, for instance, to make scrambled eggs or something. We had to crack eggs by hand individually, and there were eggs and bacon and rolls and sweet rolls and fresh fruit of one sort or another. Oh, talking about fresh fruit, those very first things we did, the concerts at the Fillmore Auditorium, there were always bushels of apples, red apples and green apples at the door. And his idea was show the kids that they can have something healthful instead of always looking for a joint to chew on or smoke, and they could get this at, and it became his benchmark. The toughest thing for me was finding bushel baskets because by then most apples were being shipped in cardboard boxes. But the craziest thing I did with him was I got a call one morning, driving on the freeway, and heard on the radio that the women's powder puff derby had just started at the Oakland airport. These are women that were flying solo in single engine planes from Oakland to New York. And they were going to land in Elmira, New York. And I'm wondering, where's Elmira? Well, I got to the office and there was a message from Bill for an urgent call. Narsai, do you know any caterers in upstate New York? I said, where the hell is upstate New York? So, the next morning, I was on a plane to fly to Elmira, New York. And as I get off the plane and coming through the corridors of the airport, here come the women carrying their statues, the winners of the Powder Puff Derby that I had heard on the radio the morning before. It was kind of a strange coincidence. Anyway, I spent a week there trying to find local caterers. And for that event, there were over 600,000 people that showed up. So I had to have people that knew that they would not be able to leave at the end of the show just because traffic would be so abhorrent. And I found a guy in Syracuse that had a refrigerated truck and could provide the food I needed for the show. I hired a local caterer to prepare 100 breakfast, lunch, dinner meals each day for the week prior to the show to take care of the staff that was building the stage and organizing everything. What had happened was that the producer for the show suddenly realized at the last minute that he had not done anything to prepare for backstage food. So he called on Bill Graham, who called on me. And day after that show, we were catering a show for Bill at the Ontario Speedway. And I was planning to just stay on the East Coast and visit friends in Connecticut, friends going back to Turlock days, my buddy from high school days and on. But he said, why don't you come back with me? I've hired a Lear jet to take us there. So it sounded like fun. At 3 o'clock in the morning, a helicopter picked us up backstage at Watkins Glen, took us to the Elmira Airport, 30 miles away, where a Learjet took us across to the Ontario Airport in Southern California. And get this, a helicopter picks us up at the airport, takes us over the freeway to the Ontario Speedway. I mean, my goodness, a car would have been just as quick, maybe even quicker. And so when Bill Graham died in a helicopter crash, nobody around him was very surprised. He just loved to be in a helicopter. And his pilot was a guy that had the nickname Tiger. No, Tiger, yeah. Killer. Thank you. That's my computer in the background filling in the blanks for me. My wife, Vini, really bails me out. Killer did not, he recommended against going up because there was quite a storm brewing. And by golly, the helicopter smashed into one of those huge power towers near in the Carquinez Straits near Martinez.
Wow.
And that was the end of Bill Graham. He was just 60 years old.
Wow. Now, I've got to tell you, just hearing about your experience in the catering industry alone, I mean, it sounds thrilling, but also really stressful.
Well, it was demanding. It was demanding and was on the go. And if you're neurotic enough to be able to do these things and they're not fearful of it, it keeps things moving.
So I'm assuming you eventually transitioned from the catering industry to then owning your own restaurant.
Oh, well, yeah, the catering was merely an introduction point. until I could afford to build a restaurant, because my goal was to have a restaurant. And even after the restaurant was built, we did a lot of catering from the restaurant.
Mm-hmm. And your restaurant opened up in 1970?
Narsai's opened in 1972, and we developed quite a reputation. The New York Times said we had one of the 10 finest wine lists in the world. The Wine Spectator magazine started to do a review of restaurant wine lists. They announced that they were going to have 2 awards, a grand award, and then for the real standouts, and then an award. And I got a call from the publisher, Marvin Shanken, said, Narsai, I just wanted to let you know that selected your list as one of the grand award winners. And I said, gee, Marvin, that's wonderful. That's great news. Tell me how many are in that group. And he said, well, to be honest with you, we haven't settled yet on whether to cut it off at 3 or 13. So that's the same as telling me that I was in the top 3, right?
Mm.
And the restaurant continued in business for 5 more years after that. And each year, we got a renewal of the same recognition.
Now tell me about the restaurant. What kind of food did you serve? What were some of your favorite dishes or most memorable dishes that you would serve?
Well, there were only 2 dishes that lasted on the menu from the day we opened until the day we closed. And the first one was also the biggest selling item on the menu, and it was my Assyrian rack of lamb.
Really?
And we used American lamb from the Superior Lamb Company here in California. And I want to tell you, this rack of lamb was a real showplace piece, because we not only removed that extra flap of meat and fat and gristle on the outside, so it was just the actual ribeye on the bone, but we trimmed away the bones so that you could either cut it with a knife and fork or just pick up the bone and chew it off without any of those little bits of bone still attached. And we also had a loin of lamb in which we trimmed the loin in much the same way. We roasted the whole loin, and the loin would serve 2 people. And it was served only for 2 people and carved at tableside, which was quite a dramatic presentation, because a large silver tray came to the table. The maitre d' would cut the meat lengthwise so it had strips shaped sort of like slices of bacon cut across the entire length of the loin. And there was a wonderfully rich sauce with it, a pilaf. Our pilafs were different practically every day, always based on white rice. This was the days before brown rice became the standard. And we would have a little bit of rye berries or wheat berries or steel cut oats, something to give a little textural difference and physical appearance. Vegetables were always fresh. So for these tableside presentations, there were at least 3 separate vegetables. Most commonly, this time of year, it would be an artichoke heart carved and filled with a squash puree. And then there would be string beans, most likely, and the rice pilaf. And all of this is carved and dished up at tableside. We also had a whole duck that was roasted on the bone, carved and served at the tableside. The menu started out as a 5-course meal. We had first a choice of either a cream soup or a clear broth soup, followed by an appetizer. It could be either hot or cold, and it changed daily. Things like, we sold all of those lamb loins, so I had lamb kidneys. I would occasionally have sauteed kidneys. There would be cold pâtés or terrines, and they have a choice of 3 different items. The entree came always with one of those pilafs and a fresh vegetable. There was no frozen vegetable in the house. And a couple of years after we got the restaurant started, we also started baking our own bread. So there was freshly baked bread each day. And then we opened in 72. In 74, 75, when there was that little bit of a hiccup in the economy, we started a special Monday night dinner that included a wine selected for the appetizer course and another wine for the entree course. on the Monday night menu, we did a dinner from a different country each week, and we would send out a monthly mailer announcing what country would be represented, the appetizer course, the main course, and the two wines selected to go with it. And these dinners, I think, started out at $7.50 for the 5-course meal. Now, this is quite a few years ago. And each of the wines, we would pour 5 glasses out of a bottle. And so you could have a glass at 1/5 the bottle price, and the bottle was priced at less than it would be on the normal dinner menu. And I'll tell you, we got a following for that where people would come in and say, oh, you don't need to give us the menu, just bring us tonight's special. And they did it from beginning to end, a glass of each wine. So that really helped pull us out.
I love to hear that you created a unique opportunity out of a difficult or challenging circumstance
Well,
at that time.
we really had to struggle to put it together. And so catering, I've often said that if it hadn't been for catering, I don't think the restaurant would have made it.
Mm.
Because during that tight period, people just were not going out. And we were sort of out of the way. We were in Kensington, which is actually a little unincorporated area north of Berkeley, but they have the same zip code as Berkeley, and most people around here think it's part of Berkeley. So we were part of the Berkeley scene. The Gourmet magazine came out with an article that said Narsai's and Chez Panisse in Berkeley were serving California cuisine. Well, I called Alice Waters and said, hey, you have any idea what California cuisine is? She said, I was thinking of calling you to ask you. The truth is, what was similar is that both of us used French as the style of our cooking. I mean, the kitchen style of cooking and presentation was really French, but everything had to be fresh. And I would go down with my wife and friends to Half Moon Bay and scrape mussels off the rocks. In those days, you couldn't buy mussels from the local purveyor because nobody had them. And in California, they were not even controlled by Fish and Game, so there was no limit on them, except there were times that the health department, which had the control on mussels, for the simple reason that mussels during certain periods of hot spell in the weather can develop a phytoplankton that is very, very dangerous to consume for people. And so what I would do is harvest the mussels, drop off a sample at the State Department of Public Health, which had their main office in Berkeley. And the next morning, they would give me the result of their test and confirm that they're perfectly safe to eat. And that day, they would be on our menu. Well, nowadays, they're harvested commercially year-round, someplace or other in Washington or on the East Coast. But we would go to the vineyards in the Napa Valley and harvest wild mustard in the springtime to use as a garnish for salads or to put into some of our dressings. We did things with local production and baking the breads ourselves. Everything became in-house. We opened a little market next door to the restaurant. All the pâtés were made in-house. Well, here's the story for you about lamb. Since we use so much lamb, we started selling some sausages and pâtés. And at first I thought we'd use some of the lamb trimmings because all those lamb racks and lamb loins produced a lot of trimmings. And the staff had, let's say, more than their fill of moussaka because it was a good place to use some of those trimmings. And I thought, why can't we put some of that in the sausages? So we experimented with it. But you know, if you get 10% lamb into a pork sausage, it dominates the flavor of the pork because lamb is so definitive. So I said, well, wait a minute. Why don't we just make a lamb sausage as a lamb sausage? And we flavor it the same way my mother used to flavor lamb kebabs. And that's why I call that rack of lamb Assyrian rack of lamb. We marinated it with pomegranate juice, onions, and garlic.
Yeah.
And we used the same ingredients ground up with the lamb trimmings. And suddenly, lamb sausages were selling so fast, I had to buy lamb shoulder to get enough lamb meat to make the sausages for the market. So the market developed quite a nice reputation and did very, very well.
Now, food brings people together. So when you would observe when looking out at the restaurant floor and seeing people gather and socialize around food, what would you observe in that context?
I thought you hit on a really good point because too often somebody who's a really good cook opens a restaurant and stays hidden in the kitchen. Well, I know there are some chefs who just operate at their best that way, but I feel I can teach a chef to produce my recipes. And after all, the name of the place is Narsai's. It's Narsai's, and people expect it to reflect my tastes. So I feel if I can teach the chef to make the food the way I want to make it, then I can be out in front and interface with the customer. And when I started the restaurant, I had a cousin named Samuel David. And of course, people always thought my name was backwards, and they always thought that he was my brother. So I was David Narsai and he was Samuel Narsai, right? I mean, that's how convoluted names can get. But we used to correct people when I said, oh no, he's my cousin. Actually, his father, Scopila, was my father's first cousin. So we were actually a little more removed.
Is Scopila Assyrian?
Oh yeah,
That's
yeah,
an Assyrian name? Okay.
yeah, Scopila. And so Sam's name was Samuel Scopila David. He has a nephew of his is the head of the Church of the East in Australia. Marmilis
Oh, okay.
is the son of Sam's sister
Okay.
who grew up in San Jose. And so we used to correct people, say, no, he's my cousin. We wanted to keep it straight. Well, one day a customer came in and said, gee, I'm sorry we missed you the last time we were here, but your brother took really good care of us. So from that day on, we called him my brother. And then my brother Jim, my youngest brother, said, hey, wait a minute. If he's your brother and you have three of you, well, what does that leave me? It was kind of a gag. But we did very nicely until he had a change in mind about where he was going with his life, and he moved to Marbella in Spain. That didn't last very long. It only lasted a couple of years, I think. But time moves on, and I hired a young woman who had been my assistant catering manager and brought her in as the maitre d' manager. And by golly, it wasn't one of the Narsai brothers greeting the guests anymore. And so I had Vini, my wife, bring our son, young teenager, for dinner at least 3 times a week. And we would sit down at 6:30. That's kind of late at night for a teenager in school to get started eating a meal. But we'd set a table right in the middle of the dining room so I could see people on all sides. And before sitting down, I would make the rounds. And after we finished dinner and Venus and Danny left, then again, I would drift around the dining room for another half hour or an hour and then slip out the back door. Well, after a couple of years of that, I said, this is no way to live. Either I give up all the other things I'm doing and go back to being a maitre d' 6 nights a week, or I close the restaurant. It was really a tough decision, I have to tell you.
As Assyrians, we like to think of ourselves as hospitable. What values from your upbringing and heritage were present in the restaurants you managed, and then, of course, in your own Narsai's?
Hospitality is the root, the very core of what I spoke early on of how much I love people and food and good wine, and how I love to make people happy. Hospitality is critical. You walk into an Assyrian home and there's immediately something to eat. My mother always had one of those glass, sort of like a carved glass bowl with a lid on it that had walnuts and raisins in it. And I used to call eating those things a crime because you can never stop eating. Well, your mouth is a little too sweet. You had a little more nut. Well, now it's not sweet enough, so you take some more raisins. It just, you can't give it up once you start. No matter how recently you may have had a meal, you're urged to sit down and join us if there's food around. So food is at the root of hospitality in an Assyrian home.
Mm-hmm. At a certain point, did you have a winery, and do you still have that winery?
Not a winery. We never had a winery, but we did and do still have a vineyard in the Napa Valley. This vineyard we bought in 1977, 76, 77, 17 acres in Oakville, which is a really prestigious area of the Napa Valley, on the valley floor. So we were not affected by the fires, which hurt the people up in the hills. On the other hand, we did have a lot of damage from the smoke of those fires. And last year we lost the entire crop.
Wow.
But fortunately the insurance covered it. Then we planted another vineyard, and for years we were just selling grapes. I mean, it was an investment. I was involved in the Napa Valley and had something to do with growing grapes, but there was no thought of making wine. But then after we planted the new vineyard over on the east side of Napa Valley, I was so excited with the quality of those grapes that I thought, by golly, let's make some wine of our own. So interestingly enough, I found a winery owned by an Assyrian in the Napa Valley, Minor Family Vineyards. Minor, as you may know, Robert Nimrod Minor was the partner of Larry Ellison when they created Oracle.
Mm-hmm.
And he sadly died at a very young age. But the family was left with quite a substantial resource and an income. And his brother, Ed Minor, opened this winery. And Robert's widow started a vineyard, not a winery. And Ed's son, David, came in to actually operate the winery. And they agreed to make a custom wine for us. So each year we would harvest between 8 and 10 tons of grapes and take it there. So we were making something like 500 or 600 cases a year. We did that for 10 years.
Now, I know with your wine, at least one of the wine labels that I've seen has had an Isa Binyamin calligraphy on it.
Right. The very first vintage, I printed those labels myself on a Heidelberg, 75-year-old Heidelberg press that I have here in the cottage. Because for a short time in my life, I was actually a printer as well. We didn't bother getting into that. And Isa Binyamin did my mother's name with this beautiful calligraphy, this I don't know what to call it. It's just a sort of artistic version of calligraphy in which the letters are stacked up to create a symbol. Her name is Shulamit. And he did this Shulamit thing for me. And I put that on the label. And the first 4 vintages had that on the label. But I'll tell you, it created such a problem in selling the wine because anybody other than Assyrian, and even some Assyrians at a glance, thought it looked like one of those Arabic glyphs. It was a little confusing to people. The name Narsai, which is in itself unusual, and then this symbol, which could be from some foreign country. What is that stuff anyway? So after the 4 vintages, we changed the name to Narsai David Estates. And then on the selection of the actual wine, it says Venus David Reserve, or Venus Selection rather, Venus David Selection. So then we put a little note on the back label with a miniature version of that glyph describing my mother's history.
As a result of selling your vineyards, are there no longer Narsai David wines that are sold in the market?
No, we do. Because we went back to Minor Family, and in order to just keep the label alive, they sold me a few barrels each year of wine they had made. I got to select the barrels I wanted, so it represented my feeling on the wine, and we continued bottling it. And now we're thinking of starting up making wine of our own from scratch.
Wonderful.
Again.
Now, the one that the Minor family has made, are any of those wines available in the market for people to purchase?
No, that it's so limited that what we made just sort of flies out.
Have you come across any other wineries or wine growers that are Assyrian?
No, I haven't. No, the basic answer is no. There's a place when we go up to the ocean on the Mendocino coast. There's a sign I pass along the way. It looks like a little cottage, and it's named Nineveh. And I keep thinking of knocking on the door and asking if, but I don't know of any other Assyrian winery as such.
A couple of years ago, I learned that a 15-liter bottle of wine is known as a Nebuchadnezzar, which I thought was pretty cool. I didn't
Yeah,
know.
well, when they named those bottles, they got a lot of these ancient names. A Magnum is 1.5 liters, and a double Magnum in Bordeaux is called a double Magnum, but in Burgundy it's called a Jeroboam. Then the 6 liter bottle is called a Rehoboam, and then there's the Balthazar, another name from ancient history, and the Nebuchadnezzar for a long time was the largest one. But then somebody came along and christened a ship with something like a 25-liter humongous bottle that got named the same name as that ship. I don't remember what it is now, but yeah, those are classic names.
Being well known and versed in the food and wine industry, you later became a radio personality. You were often on the radio. How often were you on the radio, and what did your experience with broadcasting teach you?
Well, when it started was in 1983. There was a program on KCBS radio called the KCBS Kitchen, and it was 1 hour every morning at 10 o'clock. This guy named Harvey Steinman, who since has become an editor for Wine Spectator magazine, and for 1 hour he would talk about wine and food with the regular host. And if he had to be out of town or for some reason couldn't make it, he asked me to stand in for him. Well, I got kind of a kick out of that because you're asked questions that really put you on the spot. How do I solve this problem or do that problem? What if I did this and how do and it was a challenge and it was appealing. So on the basis of that, in 1984, I started doing a Saturday version of the show that was 2 hours long called the KCBS Saturday Kitchen. And for 2 hours, people could call in. Sometimes I would have guests, sometimes I just did it alone. And then I started a project where we would taste the wine on television. And the week in advance, I would announce the name of the wine that we were going to taste. And it was always a moderate priced wine, something readily available that people could go out and buy. So people could buy the wine, and on the following Saturday, they could open it and taste it at home. Nowadays it'd be sort of like a Zoom production almost, except it's a one-way Zoom, not a two-way, and it's radio, not television. But it was really a kick because I could share ideas with people and have them tasting it at the same time. Then I closed the restaurant in 1985 and wanted to elaborate on the radio. So they agreed to give me a 1 hour slot Monday through Friday from 7 to 8 in the evening. And it was dubbed Narsai and Company. And so it was the first time there was a food and wine show on a regular basis in the evening hours. And that proved to be quite successful. In 1990, 5 years later, the hot shots from New York came out and said that the ABC station in San Francisco, KGO, was primarily talk with a lot of news. And KCBS, the CBS station, was primarily news with a lot of talk. And we had to differentiate ourselves. So overnight, we became an all news station. With an all news station, you couldn't have a guy doing a Narsai and Company program. So they wanted to keep me and the food and wine aspect alive. So we agreed to my preparing 13 small features. They're under 2 minutes each per week. And they would run 2 a day, except one on Sunday. And each of those 13 would play 3 times. So there were 39 exposures a week. And it's really fascinating because for more than, I'd have to check the dates, how many years, more than 10, I don't know if it was 20 years, I was actually heard every single day of the year, 365 days a year.
Wow.
Which is kind of an unusual bit of history.
How many listeners would the channel get on average?
Oh gosh, those are numbers I just never bothered with. It's radio. It was KCBS has been the lead radio station in San Francisco for many, many years. Both their both AM and FM, and still continues. But as things have cut back, as everything else has, I mean, the reality is that these online things are just really, really taking a chunk out of both radio and television, as you know. So I'm down now to sort of a semi-retired position where I just do one feature a week. It runs on Saturday, 3 times every Saturday.
But you're still on radio. That's wonderful.
Yeah. And there were other things along the way. I did some television. I did some local television while I had the restaurant. In fact, a woman friend who was very involved in public relations and marketing introduced me to somebody at KGO Radio. That's, once again, that ABC affiliate, a guy named Owen Spann, who had a morning talk show. And I would appear every couple of weeks and spend an hour chattering with him. And
I'm remembering the music for KGO, riding in my dad's car. KGO News Talk 810.
You got it. You got it. And then I did a little television on Channel 2 station in Oakland, KTVU. And that was a cooking demonstration that I did on live morning television. And then I met the producer of the Catherine Crosby show, which was on KPIX, the CBS television station. And for several years, I was a weekly guest there. Oh, and I had to join the union at that point because I had become a regular. And they had to pay me $29 per appearance. Well, it was really hilarious because by then the restaurant was rolling and I'd be describing something that was part of an upcoming dinner. And before I got off the air, the phone at the restaurant was ringing for people making reservations. So I said, these guys are paying me $29 to be here. I'd pay them $129 to be here.
For an advertisement, yeah.
And that led to a show called Over Easy, which was on PBS nationally, that lasted for, I believe, 6 years. It was a show that dealt with aging in America, and they had gotten Hugh Downs to come out of retirement to host the show. And after 3 years of the success of the show, he was really feeling his oats again. And he flew to New York and started the 2020 news program. And so for 1 year, he was commuting between San Francisco and New York, hosting 2020, but filming the introductions for the Over Easy. And each week I would cook a segment, and one of the guests, each week they had some of the old time entertainment people coming on, and I would cook something using one of those guests as my helper in the kitchen, so to speak. It was really a lot of fun. And that was doing very, very well until we got rid of our good governor when he became president and went to Washington. And that pretty much gutted public broadcasting. And they no longer had the funds to keep that one on the air. Sad day in politics that way things get switched around. So yeah, I've had a lot of fun with both radio and television.
Now let's transition a little bit into your Assyrian work. Something I find unique about you is that you were born in the US at a time when multiculturalism really wasn't celebrated. And so as a result, many in your generation ended up almost completely assimilating, but you did not. So what was different about your upbringing?
Well, I think it's more due to my father and mother than anything else. My father, particularly so, with being from the little tribal village of Marbishu up in the hills where church was such an important part of their life. My mother was actually in the Presbyterian church,
Mm.
and Ada, the Presbyterian missions had gotten really well established, but you go up into the mountain villages and it was just a church of the East and nothing else. Well, no, there was the Jacobite church, which now is known as the Syriac Orthodox Church. But with my father's interest in the church, and particularly my great uncle, Shamshara Hana, wow, I mean, Nzira, from his mother's conception, I mean, he could have easily, would have, under normal conditions, been at least a bishop, if not a metropolitan in the church.
Mm-hmm.
He was such a power. So all of that is in the bloodstream, and I was the firstborn. So my father not only made sure that all of us talked Assyrian at home, but he made sure I learned how to read and write the Assyrian, and I would go. He would take me to church with him on the high holy days. So all of that really became part of my life, and then helping Assyrians as we. I mean, there are so many nonprofit things that I've been involved with. Back in my 20s, I was president of the Arts and Crafts Co-op in Berkeley, which has grown into just a magnificent organization. In fact, under my presidency, we moved from a rented space inside the co-op grocery store into our own building. We actually bought a building, and that's, half a century ago, and it's still going strong and serving the artists and craftspeople in the area. In 1968, the little theater got started in South Berkeley, not far from our house, called The Theater. And they were producing wonderful works. I ran into a lot of financial difficulty and we're having trouble staying alive. And in 1972, a small group of Berkeleyans got together and created a board named the Berkeley Repertory Theater. And we raised enough money to pay off the debts of the theater, and then enough money to build a new theater. The original theater was just 90 seats, and the new theater had 300 seats. And so I was on that founding board, and I served as president for 3 years. I was a member of the board for, the numbers get a little fuzzy, 15 or 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
When I retired from the board, they did a roast of me at the Claremont Hotel as a fundraiser. And I got Paul Prudhomme, the famous chef from New Orleans, to fly in and do a course, and Wolfgang Puck, the equally famous chef, if not more so, from Los Angeles. Locally, Jeremiah Tower and Joyce Goldstein are names that people recognize. And it was done at the Claremont Hotel in Berkeley, which was the largest venue we had in the East Bay in those days. And the chef there was Hans Wiegand, who happens to be married to a cousin of mine on my mother's side. And it was a great success. We raised a lot of money, and that led to doing an ongoing series of dinners. So in the Assyrian Aid Society, which I got involved with, once we got to the point of doing fundraisers, I incorporated that same idea, and we called it Narsai's Taste of the Mediterranean. And each year there would be a dinner. We tried a couple of different locations for it, but settled on the Ritz-Carlton as the ideal place, as the best place to do these dinners in San Francisco. And those have always produced sizable income. But the Assyrian Aid Society started in 1991 by Lincoln Malik in Berkeley. And in 1992, I agreed to become the president. In 2000, I went to Iraq for a visit. and Asher Yosef was my vice president. The two of us went together. And I want you to know, we paid our entire expenses ourselves because what the money we raised from Assyrian Aid went to Assyrian Aid. There were always questions in some of the Assyrian organizations about how monies were spent or where they were spent. And I'm proud to say that our books were audited and everything was very, very clear and very clean. And that trip was so meaningful to me. I mean, we were sitting in an 8th grade history class or a math class, listening to these kids getting their entire education in Assyrian. I mean, the Assyrian Aid Society, Iraq, built these schools from scratch. They took the entire legal Arabic curriculum, translated it into Assyrian, and paid for the cost of printing those books. And it was comical in retrospect. But if you were to ask people about this guy Narsai David that came to visit, I'm sure they would say, "Oh yeah, Awani wa Bachiana." I was just so undone by sitting there listening to these kids speak such impeccable Assyrian, using words that I didn't even begin to understand, that were far too complex for me. And I had tears in my eyes all the time. Awani wa Bachiana. He was the guy that was always crying.
And from what I understand from some notes that I've taken from others, you had visited still when this was a no-fly zone, right, in Iraq?
Yes. What we did was fly into Damascus in Syria, and we spent all night driving through the desert to get to Kamishli, way up in the northeast corner, in the northeast of Syria,
Yeah.
is Kamishli, and took a boat across the river to Iraq. And I was like a kid in a swimming pool practically. I was splashing water on my face. And wow, this is almost like holy water. This is, uh, it's such an emotional experience. It was just really incredible.
And is it true that you have also a soccer tournament that's named the Narsai
They
David?
named a soccer tournament for me, and I could even show you. They sent me a couple of years ago. They sent me a soccer ball in a little framed box. The plaque reads, Narsai David Soccer Tournament, Nuhadra, Iraq, 67-62, which would be 2012.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are signatures of some of the players and a few other little scripts written right on the ball itself. And it sits on that shelf at all times. It's just...
I love it. Now, with your efforts with the Syrian Aid Society, especially with Narsai's Taste of Mediterranean, that event in particular has really elevated. It's an elevated and elegant experience, unlike any other, and really probably one of the most sophisticated experiences that I've been to that has been ran by an Assyrian. During your time with the Syrian Aid Society, approximately how much have you helped with fundraising and providing aid to Assyrians back home?
Oh, well, the Taste of the Med dinner over the years has raised almost $2 million.
That's incredible.
And there's also the Lifeline Pledge that was started by our then Vice President, Asher Yosef, in which people pledge, sort of like you do for your local public television station or public radio station, where you pledge a certain amount of money every month. And this works the same way. And that generates money very, very handily as well. People can pledge $10 a month or $500 a month, and it's automatic. It's like subscribing to a magazine, and it just becomes part of people's lives.
Now, I mean, to this day, you're actively involved in many nonprofits and foundations, including Assyrian ones, and many burn out at this age. What has helped you stay the course?
Well, first of all, I'm not as actively involved as I was. As you pointed out at the beginning of the show, that I'm about to turn 85, so I'm no longer on any active boards.
Okay.
I'm the chairman emeritus of the Assyrian Aid Society. I'm chairman emeritus of the Pacific Coast Farmers Market Association. At the Berkeley Repertory Theater, I still am involved with designing and putting together the dinners. Of course, these last 2 years there haven't been any dinners because of the pandemic. But for at the Berkeley Rep, for instance, aside from helping out in organizing the event, my wife and I donate a dinner for 12 people here at our home with rare wines from our personal collection. I include wine from 3 centuries. And at the last dinner, because there was none last year and there won't be one this year, it'll just be virtual again. But at the previous one, we had 2 buyers that were willing to pay $25,000 each. And so we agreed to do 2 of them. So that means the theater took home $50,000 that night. And I still haven't delivered those dinners because they were going to pick up those dinners in spring of last year. But that was the 4th year that we had done that kind of thing. And the number had been going up each year. It started out at 10,000, it was 15, it was 20, it was up to 25,000. And somewhere along the way we said, well, gee whiz, if there are that many people that want to spend that kind of money, well, the theater would love to have it. And we, for the Assyrian Aid dinners, we donate wine for the dinner. We donate wine for an auction. Some of those jumbo bottles, the 6-liter bottles, have been sold at those dinners.
Now, you got married at some point, and from the Stanford lecture that I've watched, I understand your wife is Bulgarian.
Yes.
How did the 2 of you meet?
Interestingly enough, that all goes back to the potluck restaurant. I was running the potluck restaurant, and she walked in one night for dinner with 2 other women. One was her roommate, and the third one was visiting here from the Midwest. But they had all been in school together at University of Wisconsin, Madison. And it's one of these corny sounding things. She walked in the door and my eyes connected with her. And pretty soon my staff was joking about it because I was behaving like I never had before. And I was spending a lot of time at their table chatting. And then I offered them an after dinner drink when they had finished their meal, and they happily accepted. And boy, was I wowed that Vini requested a Martel Cordon Bleu, which was the fanciest cognac we had in the joint at the time. And then they invited me to sit down with them. And then Vini was planning a birthday party for her roommate, and I offered to lend her a case of wine glasses to use for the tasting and help her choose some wines and so forth. And it didn't take very long after that, and we connected and married and have a child. And it's just it sounds almost corny, like it's too simple or too but these things really do happen.
I love it. How does your Assyrian heritage show up in your home and with the upbringing of your children? Because
Unfortunately, not much, because if both of us were of the same background, there'd be a common language. But since we're not speaking Assyrian with each other, our son just has, a trickle of a few words. But he has lots of Assyrian cousins and close enough friends that he understands the heritage, but he doesn't speak any Assyrian.
The last question that we always like to leave the guests with to answer is we sort of give the mic to you if there's anything that you'd like to say as a last piece to those who are listening.
Well, I love my Assyrian heritage, and I just wish that people of means would help support the people who are left behind. My great uncle at Ahana was saving lives by sending money. That was at a pretty critical time. In my mind, I don't think there's any chance of there being another Assyria. I think those days are gone. History has moved pretty fast up until now. Now it's moving at an even greater speed. And it's too late to talk about that, but it's not too late to save the language. It's not too late to help those in need who are there and are suffering. But it's going to take an active commitment on the part of a lot of people to do that. And with countries all over the world struggling to make ends meet, it's not like you could send some money and say, here, we'll bring that family to the United States. You can't do that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But there are sizable Assyrian settlements in Sweden now and in Germany, and of course, enormous settlement in Australia. But there are a lot of people with our ancestry that are in trouble and need help. And I would just implore people to not forget their Assyrian ancestry. If they don't want to be involved in joining a club or attending meetings somewhere, that's fine. Those aren't for everybody. But by golly, you can send $10 or $20 or $100 a month on the Lifeline Pledge. You could attend some of the functions that are put on, outsiders as well. But it's getting something involved within the community.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be my hope for the future.
Thank you very much, Narsai. I really appreciate your time on the podcast.
Adessa, thank you. Nice to be with you.
That's it for this week. I know, amazing, right? Don't forget to rate and review our podcast on whatever platform you listen to us. And if you loved this episode, please share it with 3 other people. Thanks, and see you next Tuesday.